Many of us can barely remember a time when we didn't have cell phones. In fact, they've become such an integral and common part of our lives that we've ceased to question the technology anymore. One man who has not stopped questioning is Dr. Nick Begich. Best known for his work in the area of HAARP, Dr. Begich has turned his attention to 21st century technologies and the truth behind their interface with the human body and brain. This is an interview not to be missed and one that you'll likely want to share with your family and friends. We're talking about 21st century technologies, and one of the really interesting, I think fascinating technologies that affect most of us now is cell phone technology. And it's my understanding that some of this may actually be affecting us in a negative way.
Yeah, and that's right. Cell phones have been one of the few devices that we've had in large circulation where we've actually taken something that produces a radio frequency signal and stuck it right next to the head. And this created quite a bit of controversy. Many will remember years ago there was an incident in Florida where somebody had asserted they had a brain tumor form from cell phone use, and there was a lawsuit filed. The Congress got involved, and this became quite the controversy. And what happened in those congressional hearings, eventually the industry agreed to do a $25 million study where they would look at cell phones and the literature surrounding cell phones and what had already been done in the research, and try and figure out whether indeed there was a biological effect, an effect on our health or on our minds. And so what happened is they hired a guy named Dr. George Carlo, and Dr. Carlo put together a team of experts. The unusual thing was, instead of reporting to, say, an engineering group or something like this with the cell phone industry, his primary contact was their chief lobbyist in Washington, D.C. After 5 years, he had completed his work. He produced a study. The industry went forward with it and said everything is wonderful and everything is safe. And George Carlo was so incensed because he felt that there were significant problems with cell phones, and he published a book called Cell Phones: The Invisible Hazards. And what he showed, and his theoretical model was that the heat transfer from the phone into the head actually caused a breakdown of the blood-brain barrier, the things that separate toxins from getting into the brain. And he felt that the most likely mechanism for tumor formation was, in fact, the slowing of the repair of DNA, which normally would take place, but by slowing it down, that's where the tumor formation would occur. And that's what he felt the mechanism was.
But you're saying that the heat transfer was creating a slowing down of the normal DNA repair?
That's correct. And this slowing down is sort of the root of the problem in that particular incident. Now, what he looked at was he looked at children, say at 5 years old, and at 5 years old, 400% more energy actually transfers through the phone, through the skull, because of skull thickness is much smaller in a 5-year-old than in an adult. A 10-year-old, 200% more energy transfers, and then, of course, the adult transfer. Now, in Great Britain, they take this into consideration. The beginning of the school year, there are warnings that go out that tell parents, if your kids are under 16, dissuade their use from cell phones, because they utilize in Europe what's called the precautionary principle, which says that once you have information that says there may be a problem, you don't wait till there's absolute proof. You begin to give that information to the public so they can utilize that information in making decisions. Now, this applies to areas in health and areas within the environment. And this principle has been applied in Europe about 30 years, and never once have they been wrong. Not waiting for this final proof of the studies like we do in the United States. Now, there's been several other studies beyond George Carlo's. There was one study that we actually cite in some of our work that involved 15,000 individuals in Scandinavia. Now, Scandinavia, Finland in particular, Nokia was sort of the beginning of this whole industry, and so the density of the population that use cell phones is quite high, and there's some history, there's some time that we can actually take a look over a period of time. Now, what that study said is essentially an hour of use, which is per day, which is pretty standard, when you think about how people use these things all over the world now, was sufficient to create a number of effects. One of those effects was heating behind the ears, which most people go, yeah, I feel that. The other was interference with sleep rhythms, interference with short-term memory, interference with sex drive. All these things were being reported, not just the most severe situations of tumor formation, but these other types of incidences. Fatigue was often reported associated with excessive cell phone use. The problem with the device, and you can go back to the work of Professor Lin at the University of Washington back in the 60s, was doing work for the Navy where he was analyzing various energy forms in the microwave range, in the range of cell phones, precisely in the range of cell phones, and looking at physiological effects. And what he found in 5 out of 6 studies, there was actually mutation in the formation of chick embryos because of changes to DNA structures. So when cell phones came out and Dr. Carlo's reports came out, and then the industry said everything is safe, this gentleman came forward and said, wait a minute, you know, we did these studies before cell phones ever existed, and we know that energy densities that are equal to what cell phones produce in those frequency ranges are, in fact, hazardous to a person's long-term health. And so this individual was just one. The other one that came forward was Ross Addy. And Ross Addy, which is A-D-E-Y, if you do a search on the internet, he is one of the most published scientists in the world. He had hundreds of peer-reviewed papers. He was used extensively by the military for looking at all kinds of electromagnetic field effects on human beings. Even Motorola hired him once to look at cell phones. And what he had found is one particular range that cell phones operated within would actually create a beneficial health effect. But the fact that it created any effect then moved this into the realm of the FDA. So the funding was pulled, his project was canceled. Ross Addy also, prior to his death, came forward, and you'll see it on the internet with a good search, and he was incensed by the fact that the industry was dampening what the public was really entitled to know, that there were things that could be done. Now, since Carlo's work came out, there have been over a dozen patents filed by the industry to make cell phones safer. And we're not just talking cellular phones. The home portable phones actually can be potentially more dangerous because the energy densities tend to be a little more intense, because the batteries can be recharged regularly. You're not worried about conserving that battery juice or conserving that energy. At the same time, the circuitry is more poorly designed, so you have more leakage from those circuits, more radiation actually coming off of the phones. The ideal cell phones, because they're not going away. I mean, obviously, we're going to have them for forever. The thing that can change is the way in which they're designed. And this is, again, something that could be easily integrated into cell phone design. If you take the speakerphones, for instance, that you hold, away from your head, that distance is sufficient for most theoretical models to make them quite safe and reasonable. Of course, your conversation is no longer private, but is it anyway when you're on the cell phone?
Well, what about the little earbuds and earpieces?
No, some of the earpieces are quite good. If the insulators are well designed and well made, it's fine. But often you find them very thinly insulated, and they actually shunt energy into the inner ear. And so you feel even more heating concentrated sort of in the ear. In that case, there's some simple things that a person could do. One of those is taking a small piece of magnetic metal, like baling wire, that you can pick it up with a magnet. And if you make a coil around that lead wire that's coming into the ear, so you have the wire coming in, you make a coil around this part, what happens is as the energy moves up, it hits that coil and it dissipates, doesn't make it in the inner ear. It's similar to what those small devices now with electronic equipment that they clip on so you don't get the disturbance. Mm-hmm. It's essentially taking that energy and dissipating it in a way that it doesn't interfere. And the same can be done cheaply and simply. I mean, anyone can do that with the earbuds. The other thing to consider is where you place the phone. I mean, most people, what do? They put the phone on their waist. Well, there you have a lot of soft tissue, so the heat energy actually penetrates deeper. So you can affect the internal organs in a way that might not be beneficial at all. The ideal is, with that type of earpiece, to set the phone next to you. If you don't have that kind of earpiece, just the manner in which you hold the phone. Get your index finger between you and that phone. Get a little bit of distance, because just an inch of distance, you can still hear fine, will cause that energy concentration or energy density to be reduced by probably 2 or 3 times. Just getting it away from the ear and not pressing it up against the head where that energy transfer happens fairly efficiently. So simple things can be done.
But I've seen other small devices, just little buttons, pads, little bits of film that are sticky that they say can help if you stick it on the inside the battery or on top where the antenna is. How effective are those kinds of ameliorating technologies?
No, we researched this because we were very interested in, when we talk about technology, we also like to talk about what are the solutions and what's out there. And the ones I've already given are the ones that cost nobody anything, and that's, of course, the ideal. The other thing that you're speaking about is these small RF absorbers or some kind of ceramic materials. Now, we went and looked at everything out there on the market. About the same time, the Federal Trade Commission in the United States was doing the same thing. And they jerked 7 devices off the market for making false claims because they had no science behind them whatsoever. When we went out and looked, we found one device with a U.S. patent, and that particular device we've carried for years because it has the science behind it. And it was developed by one of the largest electronics companies in Korea that was looking for a ceramic material and something to buffer microcircuits from RF, from radio frequency interference, because that's a big problem with fine circuit design. So you need certain kinds of insulators or things to protect those circuits. And as a side, a spin-off for them, they developed a similar technology that could be used on cell phones, and they applied for the U.S. patent, and they received it. But it only reduces the energy by about 60% in the cell phones tested, which is, it's a nice step in the right direction, but at the same time, there are claims being made by others that you can knock out 100% of the energy. If you knock out 100% of the energy, then the phone is not, and there's no battery in it, because you can't do that. And the fact is, a certain amount of energy has to flow through the circuit. A certain amount of that energy is going to leak from that circuit. The ideal would be to see the industry put the requisite energy and effort into building better ceramic materials, but this, of course, drives the cost of the hardware up, which creates the problem. The other thing is the way the phones are rated. Between one model within the same brand name and another model within the same brand name, we have seen as much as a 600% difference from one phone to the other in terms of how much energy is transferred. And we've put on our website, which is probably going to be linked to this, the idea that there's 10 that are the worst and 10 that are the best, and then there's a website that's indicated where you can go and look at all the phones that have been made to see how they rate. The rating system should be promoted. They should discuss that rating system, and those ratings right now are on the inside of the package where you can't see them when you buy the phone, and they should be on the outside so people can make informed decisions and get the best phone possible. In the interim, speaker phones are the best. Hold them away from your head. Secondly, until all of the evidence is in, children should not be using cell phones at all.
And they're popularized in every sitcom where little teeny boppers have their cell phones on from age 8.
Right. And kids are, kids are out there. They're using them all the time. It is, all the promotion in the United States is oriented about family use, kids use. Yet, when you look at the literature, we did an article on this. We published it some time ago on the web. It's on our website. There's 89 source documents cited. All of them are mainstream or academic studies, things that people could sink their teeth into. But we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry, an industry that is not going to go away. And from my perspective, over time, what we're going to see is CEOs and very active people, leaders, the kind of people that use these phones for hours and hours a day, attorneys. Johnny Cochran just died of a brain tumor. Start looking at how many people are dying of brain tumors today versus 20 years ago, and I think you're going to see a trend line that eventually is going to get disclosed to the public as another mystery illness. The only difference is the correlations between what side of the head you're holding your phones would indicate a great deal. And I think this is something that needs not more study, but immediate discussion. The studies can continue, but people need to know so we can make the wise decisions that we need to make. As busy as I am, I don't have a cell phone. And I value my private time. The drive time is private time for me. But there are good reasons to not have them. For me, the health is the least of those reasons. From my perspective, it's the privacy question.
Which is what I was going to ask you right off of that, as a matter of fact. And I bet your kids don't carry any cell phones on them either.
You know, the privacy issue is a big deal.
This is a big deal. Yeah, a lot of people are concerned with the fact that they're everyday citizens, not particularly concerned that they're doing anything that's questionable, but nonetheless that there's a tracking possibility for where you are every moment when you have your cell phone on you.
Absolutely. These phones are now built with GPS systems, geographic positioning systems, so you can be located easily in case of an emergency, as the storyline goes. But the reality is, every time you make the call, every time that you're on the line, when you register the call, it's who called, where you called, and where you were when you called. So in case of criminal investigations in Switzerland and other places, they have used this data and been able to go backwards and then trace all of your movements. And you may not feel like, you know, as they say, well, if you don't have anything to hide, what are you worried about? The worry is, who's deciding? You know, this is the same question that was raised when Adolf Hitler marched through Germany and Europe, was if you don't have anything to hide. The fact of the matter is, those in charge have no right to penetrate our personal privacy in that way. I mean, why should our movements be tracked? Why should that data be collected? And the reason it is because it can be. It's cheap. Data storage is cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, so longer and longer amounts of communication records can be kept. And ultimately, this integrates into what turns into a much more directed and controlled society, which is, you know, when you start jumping into these issues, you start looking at how does technology integrate, what do those integrations do, and how does that change how we're perceived. And what's happened, cell phones as a small little niche in this, we become increasingly transparent as human beings and technological societies. Well, at the same time, our governments and those organizations that regulate us become more and more opaque. Just the opposite of what ought to be occurring.
And people have read about cases where it's been admitted into evidence, shopping records, for example, through our convenience cards, because those records are also made available in case of, say, a criminal investigation. So this we've known about for a while. We know about the cell phones. What other kind of technologies are being employed that are, in essence, invading our rights to privacy, and what's coming down the pike?
Well, this is, you know, to me, these are the big issues. I mean, as we start to look at personal privacy and technology, you can think about transaction tracking like what we're talking about here. You know, your little discount card, all your credit cards, your medical records, your utility bills, your passport information, your driver's license, your real estate transaction. I mean, think of all of the things that we do as individuals that ultimately makes it in somebody's database. What these databases turn into is giant data banks. You know, one of the big ones that just got nailed for losing a bunch of records, ClearPoint, you know, and this is because they maintain billions and billions of records on individuals so that you can use it for what's called soft intelligence, or what the Europeans now call in the European Parliament data valence, where they review the data as a method of surveillance to determine a whole lot about individuals. You know, you talk about racial profiling. This is, you know, a leapfrog way above that. This is looking at all transactions and then drawing assessments from them. And that same company actually signed contracts in the late 90s with the Department of Justice to be available as a source for material for developing that kind of soft intelligence for criminal investigation and those kinds of uses.
Is this information used for anything beyond criminal intelligence, gathering of criminal intelligence?
Well, you know, under the Patriot Act and the kind of legislations that have been passed since 9/11, you know, we took this issue on pre-9/11, and we published a book about this, Earthrising the Revolution, to talk about all these kinds of issues and sort of their impact and predicting, you know, what will happen if. When 9/11 happened, everything, of course, changed, and the what-ifs became the here and now. And so when you talk about these kind of technologies, there tends to be more willingness to accept these kinds of invasive technologies in terms of our personal privacy in exchange for what we think is safety and security. So you see large changes happening in the area of biometrics, you know, which is used to be just we thought of IDs as thumbprints. Now biometrics extends to anything unique to your own biology. For instance, your iris is unique as a thumbprint, so an iris scan can give you the same kind of information. Positive ID is what it boils down to. Heat emanations from the face are as unique as your thumbprint. The idea of a voice print, 5 to 20 seconds of your voice, is as unique as your thumbprint. So,
where's this information being harvested?
Well, I think, you know, when you look at first of all, the systems. This is a big, you know, how do you collect all this data? You know, when you go back you got to go back a little bit, and we got to talk about a project that began just after World War II, and it was the Echelon program, which involved 5 countries. It was the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. And what we did is we agreed after World War II to exchange what was called then signal intelligence. You know, radio, broadcast, telephone was kind of new. It wasn't in every house in those days. But to use each other to survey each other's population so we wouldn't violate our own domestic laws, or in the United States, our Constitution, because you just couldn't go out and on a wholesale basis survey everybody, but the Canadians could do it and provide the data to our security agencies, which is exactly what has transpired. There's an article, November 2003, in all places National Geographic, that lays this out. We laid it out 3 years before in our earlier work, but it's nice to see it in a mainstream publication. And they talk about Echelon, they talk about the idea of analyzing that data, and here's been the problem. For the NSA, which does it on the United States side, it's been, how do you get all the electronic communications? You know, we're talking about telephones, faxes, internet. I mean, just think of all the ways that people communicate. How do you pick out all those billions of individual communications and sort it? Well, supercomputers do the first job, and they do it with the establishment first of what are called dictionaries. Now, dictionaries, as you and I think about them, are little books with words in them. The way these agencies think about them is it's that plus word phrases, voice information, voice print information. You know, when Osama bin Laden goes on the phone and they say, or does a press conference that they try and interpret, they say it takes weeks to figure out. It doesn't. It takes seconds. They know immediately who it is. That's why he got rid of all forms of electronic communication before he hit the trail. And that's why we can't find him. There's no electronic signature to go after because he's not on the grid, so to speak. By the same token, when you look at sort of the invasiveness of all this and where it heads, there was a paper put together. It was called The Revolution in Military Affairs and Conflict Short of War. And it was 1989 or 90 by the U.S. Army War College. And it was, you know, that's a really good institution in terms of laying doctrine out for military training and leaders that are coming. And they looked at all of these technologies and much, much more as a change that was so profound in terms of what was happening. They equated the changes in military technologies from the days of gunpowder being introduced into Europe in the Middle Ages or the atomic weapons of the last century. Those are the kind of changes that they say are coming based on electromagnetic systems for surveillance and offensive weaponry. So when you talk about sort of where does it go, what they said in this was there were several things that we could do that would increase our capacity as a country militarily, but these things would run counter to American values. One of the examples that was given within this paper was microchip technology that could be embedded in service personnel that would be used in 89 and 90 for just GPS, for locating them in the battlefield. And you know, if you were going in the battlefield, you might want that. I mean, if you were going in and you got captured or got hurt and you wanted to be extracted and found rapidly, you know, this would be ideal. So in that sense, if you had a vote on it, that would be great, but as we know in the military, you don't get votes, you get orders, so everybody does what they're told. The problem is they didn't stop there. They suggested that this be installed in every business traveler because it's a volatile world, but don't worry, they won't turn them on unless there's a problem, is what they said. The problem with all that is it really runs counter to how Americans and most free peoples feel about their government's ability to monitor activity, although already in the Attorney General's office in Mexico City, they have installed 200 people with microcircuits to track their movements. This was major media in the last year has come out, and they'd like to have their entire bureaucracy chipped for tracking purposes. The places it also comes up is with elders who are losing mental faculties for keeping track of them, children because of fear of kidnapping, prisoners on parole instead of ankle bracelets, sex offenders for life so you can track where they're at and where they've been all their lives. And many people would go, you know, those would be all right applications, at least today. Pre 9/11, nobody believed that.
Right, that's true. And so now the government can have the media throw up an orange alert and everybody says, I'll do it, I'll do it. Is that what's going on?
That's exactly what's going on. And here's what this paper said. This paper projected that the only way that these technologies and many others that they reference could be advanced would be a change in American values. And they believe that the only way those values would change is in an environment of fear. stimulated by two things: international terrorism and international drug trafficking.
When was this written?
89 or 90. But in any case, you can see it referenced in our work. And the point of the matter is, look at what's happened since 9/11. Look at the PSAs, the public service announcements that tie drug trafficking and terrorism together, that start to amplify that kind of fear. One of the things in that paper that it said that was highly disturbing was the idea that we could use this intelligence and maybe combine it with other technology to knock an aircraft out of the sky that was carrying suspected terrorists, for example. So we'd knock it out of the sky, it'd crash, and when you looked at all of it, it would look like pilot error. And the argument was made that maybe the Constitution stopped at the doorstep of the United States and didn't carry beyond our boundaries. Now, there's nobody that I have met along the road of life that believes that our military drops the Constitution at the door. Quite the contrary. It goes with them. Those are the values that we expect them to carry, not forget. Now, this was actually, it actually happened that the NSA provided the Peruvian Air Force less than a year ago information and intelligence on a drug trafficking aircraft. The Peruvian Air Force went up, shot the aircraft down, and it contained a couple of missionaries, not drug traffickers at all. So the problem they predicted could happen, which is downing the wrong aircraft, did happen, and there was no deniability. The United States was culpable, but nobody's been held responsible. So we are already engaged in the violation of our own sense of right and wrong, because all these things violate basic constitutional provisions like a presumption of innocence, a jury, a judge, and an outcome.
Well, none of it sounds to bode well right now. From a consumer advocate point of view, what can the average person do in terms of protecting themselves in any way other than not having a cell phone? But it sounds like that's really just a drop in the large bucket where these invasions of our personal rights seem to be taking place.
Absolutely. The key elements are several. Firstly, the idea of educating the public on what these technologies do. Technology generally doubles about every 10 months, from the invention of the wheel to where we are today. So it becomes extremely important that technological issues get some public debate. One of the roles that we've played in the last 11 years is to try and force that debate, to bring information out. Working with over 200 radio and TV producers around the world, we continue to take the information forward, build our databases, and get the information out, hoping that we could see the political changes that are necessary to properly regulate and protect the values that Americans and other free peoples around the world hold in common. And that ultimately is the first step in the right direction. It has to be education followed by political action that restrains and constrains industry from abusing power that technology today offers. And in all of our work, what we have found is the abuses of technology, the abuses of power, are not based on some sinister viewpoint held by a few, but based on the concepts that their ideas are important, they want to further their ideas, and they're using technology to do it. And sometimes people get a little zealous. And I think whether you're from the left or the right, the temptation, Zbigniew Brzezinski said it in Between Two Ages, a book he wrote in the early 70s before he was National Security Advisor Jimmy Carter, that as these technologies evolved, that the left or the right would be tempted to use them to further their political ends. And I think that's what we're seeing, is these technologies are being used, not just for political purposes, but for many purposes, under the illusion of creating safety and security. But what are we creating that safety and security for, if it's not to maintain those basic values that have been the American character, that have been who we are as human beings? And that's what's missing in the equation.
For more information on the subject, check out Dr. Begich's website. And for those of you who are curious about the HAARP project, which Dr. Begich has spent so many years investigating, you'll also find the interview with Jerry E. Smith quite an eye-opener. Until next time, thanks for watching.